This video is sponsored by Keeps.
I'd like to talk to you about a very serious matter. Recently, my friend, who's from the Midwest, told me how it's becoming a thing for people to get cattle troughs, stock tanks, and use them to float down the river. Now, when I heard this, I was extremely excited. This sounded like the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. Until I did a Google search and realized that this is what that looks like. Leave it to the Midwest to think that's cool. But if there's one thing I've learned throughout the years, it's that disappointment is simply an opportunity for improvement. So after seeing those pictures, I realized there's only one thing I could do: buy a stock tank and spend way too much money and time trying to make it cool. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. Is this a good idea? To take a stock tank and try and make a legitimate boat out of it? I don't know. Probably not, but that's never stopped me before.
Well, I guess there's really only one place to start, and that's go down to my local farm store and buy a stock tank. I never bought a stock tank before, so I just picked out a nice shiny one and decided to load it in the back of my truck. Now, I could have gone for a bigger one, 8 feet in diameter, but I decided this is my first stock tank boat build ever. Let's not jump the gun. So I went for this nice 5.5 foot wide one. Getting it into my truck was a little tricky. Craig decided not to help at all. You could have put the camera down, you jerk. But I got it up there in the end, and we were off to the races. Now, from what I gleaned in my online research, people would take these stock tanks and basically just put a picnic table on the inside, sit on it, maybe some lawn chairs, and float down the river. That is the opposite of what I want to do here. My thought was, can we take this stock tank and use it as a starting point to make a legitimate boat that we can cruise down the river or lake in style? Am I going to put a motor in it? You bet your stock tank I am. But that'll obviously come towards the end. First, we have to start making this look like a boat. The nice thing about projects like this that nobody's ever really done before is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. The most important thing is you just have to do it. So Craig helped me lift the stock tank up onto some sawhorses to make a better working height, and it was time to start building, I guess. Now, the first thing I did was trying to determine the somewhat center of the stock tank. I did this by looking at it with my eyes and drawing a line with a Sharpie. That's close enough to center, I think. Next, I'm going to frame out my boat structure with just strips of Akume plywood. Now, this is a marine grade plywood. It does well with water, and I've used it to build boats in the past, so I decided why not use it again. I'm using 1/2-inch plywood because I think it'll be a little bit more bendy and allow me to get that nice boat shape. Now, I decided I'm going to use the stock tank as like the cockpit portion of the boat. Do you call it a cockpit in a boat? I don't know, the place you sit. And then I'm going to build a bow off the front. That'll be, the front of the boat. And then I'll put the motor on the back. So really all of my frame is going to be built off the front. So I grabbed 2 pieces of Akume plywood and I clamped them on either side. I mean, if you ask me, it's already starting to look like a boat. So I knew we were on the right path. But really, I have no clue. Now, I went back and forth a long time on trying to figure out the best way to attach wood to the metal stock tank. And then finally I got on Amazon and I bought a rivet gun. I've never used rivets before, but I thought, rivets go in metal, and this might be the best way to attach the wood to the thin metal wall. Because as far as I can tell, it's still going to be pretty watertight, because the rivet completely fills up the hole that you have to drill in the side of the tank. So I think this will work. Sure enough, I put my first couple of rivets in, and as far as I could tell, the plywood was held nice and secure, and it looked like a pretty tight fit on the inside of the stock tank. So, all in all, I think this is going to be a good method. Yeah. Happy with my wood to metal attachment solution, I just set to work attaching the remainder of my pieces of plywood. And by that I mean the 2 pieces I had cut at this point. Now I know at this point you're probably looking at this thing thinking there is no way this is ever going to become a boat. I mean, he's using duct tape right now to connect those 2 front pieces. But trust me, I have no plan, so pretty sure it's going to work. After doing my top frame triangle, as I like to call it in the boat making world, I actually just made that up, I decided to do another framed triangle on the bottom. But this one's not going to come out quite as far. That way when I connect the top triangle to the bottom of the triangle, it's going to create a nice slope at the bow to give it that boat look. So I cut some more pieces of Akume plywood to length, and I started attaching them to the lower section of the stock tank, making sure that they were pretty much parallel with that upper brace piece. I added a few more rivets, and now we had a lower triangle. I held this together with a little more duct tape. Don't worry, that's just temporary while I get the shape figured out. And then I stood back and stared at it for a while, as one does when they don't know what they're doing. Then I grabbed some more scrap pieces of plywood and started trying to figure out how I'm going to connect this lower triangle to the upper triangle. I quickly realized that I needed to unduct tape my 2 pieces and attach some sort of connector from the upper part to the lower part. Well, I'm already using plywood for everything, so I grabbed some long pieces of plywood, squirted a little Total Boat Thixo on there, and I clamped them in place. Next, I just used a few small screws to hold the pieces of plywood until that Thixo dries, and I'm on to step number 2, I guess. Still have no plan. But my thought is I can kind of pinch these 2 pieces together to create that front boat shape. So after getting my screws and Thixo on there so everything will glue up nice and tight, I tried to pinch my 2 front pieces together. And I think it's actually gonna work pretty well. If I can get these 2 pieces to come together, it's gonna give me that nice boat shape at the front. I think. One thing I did notice was those 2 plywood pieces were a little too long, so I couldn't get them together the way that they really should be for a boat. So I trimmed off the tops. I thought this would allow me to get them a little bit closer. Then I climbed inside the boat and used my man clamps to really force them together. I quickly realized that I'm going to need some sort of piece to screw the plywood to. So I cut a little scrap piece of ply to try and figure out the angle in between those 2 pieces once they're pinched together. Once I got it somewhat close, I used my table saw to cut a bigger piece of stock pine. Yep, I'm using pine in my boat, because that's what you do, to that angle. And it gave me this big, beefy, wedge-shaped piece that, for lack of a better term, is going to make up the bow of my boat. So I took that giant wedge piece, I lubed it up with a bunch more Thixo. If you don't know what Thixo is, it's just thickened epoxy. It's really easy because it comes in this squeeze tube and it mixes in the tip and it's strong as all get out. So after squirting some of that on either side, I screwed one side to my wedge, and then all I had to do was pinch it together and screw the other side on. But this is easier said than done, because there's a lot of force I'm fighting against trying to bend that plywood into that curved shape. But I managed to get it together in the end, and I just slowly worked my way down the bow and inserted all those screws. Now I've got this nice boat-shaped carcass, skeleton, and it's starting to, look like something. So much so that I wanted to do a little shimmy shake. Now that I have the outer framework in the right shape, I can start bracing it out on the internal portion of the structure. So I grabbed another piece, cut it to the angle of my bow, squirted some more Thixo on there because, well, I'm going to use a lot of Thixo in this build, because that's what you do when you build a boat out of a stock tank. You glue it together. Now on the portion that attaches to the stock tank, well, I just used some more Thixo. I put some in the center and then I kind of used it as caulking around the outside. And then from the inside, I added some screws directly into the end of that brace piece. Next, I had to cut some ribs that would hold that brace piece on the inside to the brace pieces on the outside. I'm going to use the word brace piece a lot in this video, so just be prepared for that. This was a little tricky because each one of those pieces had to be cut at a compound miter, meaning that it was cut on 2 different axes. So it had an angle on one side and then it had an angle on the other side, so it took a little while to figure out. But to attach these, I just used some more Thixo and some brad nails. The brad nails are really there just to hold it together until the Thixo dries. And you might be thinking, this is not going to be strong enough. And you're right. Any one of these joints by itself is not going to be strong enough. But once you hook them all together and each joint triangulates off the other joint, you get a lot more strength. And I'm confident once we skin this with plywood and add all of our other bracing, well, I think it'll be strong enough to go down the river, but only time will tell. As I was putting this together, I kept just laughing as I looked at it, because despite the fact that all this is attached to a giant cattle trough, this actually isn't the worst way to build a boat. And I've built boats this way before. Once I got back to the tank itself, I used some rivets to attach those rib pieces directly to the cattle trough. Now up to this point, all my ribs have just been straight, but once I got to the stock tank, I had to deal with the round shape of the tank itself. And as you can see, my 1/2-inch plywood isn't going to make that turn. So I went over to my chop saw, I put it in its trenching mode, and I added a bunch of kerf cuts all the way along my board. This is going to allow me to bend that piece of plywood and hopefully match the shape of the stock tank. Sure enough, I had just enough wiggle room to force that brace piece inside. Now, all I'm going to do is glue this piece on, because it really just has to create a lip for me to rest my plywood upper skin on and secure it. It's not really providing a ton of strength. So I added a bunch more Thixo to the back of this piece, I slid it in there, and the friction from its position will hold it in place until that Thixo dries. I did the same thing on the other side because, believe it or not, the boat is symmetrical, and then I was on to the ribs on the lower portion. I did this the same way as the upper portion, the only difference is there's no central spine, so I could send the ribs all the way across. Now I did want to make sure that my lower ribs were exactly in line with my upper ribs, so I used this piece clamped on my upper ribs as a guide to position my lower ribs. And one by one, I just worked my way back until I had the entire lower section framed out. Now my rough plan is to skin this entire thing with 1/4-inch Akume plywood, which means that I couldn't have a harsh transition from that front plywood framing to the stock tank, so I needed to continue that 1/2-inch plywood all the way around and meet up with the framing on the opposite side. Lucky enough, after kerf cutting some 1/2-inch pieces of ply, I was able to bend them fairly easily and rivet them in place to the upper and lower portions of my tank. I'm not gonna lie, after putting in all these rivets, my mind was reeling with other possibilities of riveting things. Could I make an airplane? Could I make the Titanic? Could I build a bridge? Probably not, but it's fun to think about. After I had plywood wrapped all the way around the tank on the top and bottom, I added some more bracing on the bottom, again just to create a lip for my plywood to land on once I plywood the bottom. And then I wanted to connect the upper framing to the lower framing with some nice vertical supports. This is also why I made sure that the upper ribs were in line with the lower ribs, so that when I added these pieces, they went on nice and easy. Now I just cut these pieces long, not worrying at all about the angles, and I'll come back later and I'll trim them to be the exact height as the top and bottom of the boat. So I squirted a little more Thixo on each piece, added 1 screw just to hold it until the Thixo dried, and worked my way all the way back until the entire structure was braced from the top to the bottom. Now I thought about using a Japanese pole saw to flush trim each one of these, because I'm a woodworker, But in the end, a multi-tool is way faster. A little zip, a little zap, a little zoop, and it looks like I spent a lot more time making these than I actually did. And it's quite satisfying trimming them all to the right height. Ooh, I did the same thing on the bottom, and all in all, this thing was starting to look pretty cool. Now I knew when I tried to skin the sides, this harsh flat nose was going to be a problem as far as running the plywood along. So I took the offcuts from my initial wedge, I glued them together into this triangle shape, and I screwed that onto the very front so that everything came to a nice eased point. Now I completely guessed on the shape of this boat, so after standing back and looking at it, I didn't like how this front looked. I just thought it stuck up a little bit too high, so I traced a line to give it more of a natural boat shape, and I cut to that line again with the multi-tool. Just broke off this little piece of plywood, and then I used the multi-tool to just carve the bow to be that shape. Is this pretty? Well, no, it's actually going to be all gnarled and ugly, but don't worry, we're going to cover this up with plywood and you're never going to see it. All that matters is that the slope of the bow matches the framing on the rest of the boat. After cutting it with the multi-tool, it was still a little bit rough, so I grabbed some 3M Cubitron 2 sandpaper, slapped it on my Rotex, and made a nice, smooth transition. And believe it or not, with that, I think we're ready to add our plywood skins.
This video is sponsored by Keeps. Now, if you're like me, you've probably noticed that you're getting a little thin upstairs, if you know what I mean. But in today's age, you don't have to accept it. There's actually things you can do, and that's where Keeps comes in. The thing I love about Keeps is it's convenient. You can get expert care for hair loss from the comfort of your own home without ever visiting a doctor's office or pharmacy. I mean, that's pretty darn simple. Treatments delivered right to your door on your schedule, so you can opt for delivery every 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever works best for you. To date, Keeps has helped nearly 1 million men keep their hair, which is probably why they have over 4,500 5-star reviews. According to clinical studies, treatments offered by Keeps are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by up to 35%. They deliver treatments directly to your door in discreet, non-branded packaging. As part of your Keeps treatment plan, you can message your medical provider or the Keeps care team anytime via their secure messaging portal. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/bourbonmoth or click the link in the video description. That's Keeps, KEEPS.com/bourbonmoth.
To skin our vessel, I'm going to use 1/4-inch Akume plywood for the sides and top, and then I'll use 1/2-inch plywood for the bottom. Because, you know, rocks and things are in the river and you don't want a 1/4-inch bottom. The rock might just poke through. But 1/2 inch will be fine. So I cut down some strips of 1/4-inch ply and I just carried it over to our boat and kind of started to clamp them in place to see what we were working with. Now, the plywood is only 8 feet long, and obviously I need longer sheets than that to wrap around the entire boat. And if I was building a legitimate boat, yes, I would take the time to either kerf and glue my plywood together or do some sort of CNC puzzle piece seam to create longer pieces of plywood. But this is a stock tank boat after all, and I didn't want to spend the time doing that. So I'm going to use a much more redneck version of hooking plywood together, which you'll see here in a little bit. But for now, I clamped my 1/4-inch plywood onto the boat and traced out the general shape that I needed. Then I cut that shape with the track saw, and I think we're ready to glue and screw this to our boat. After cutting it, I carried it back over one more time just to double check that it was going to fit, which I was happy to see it did. And then it was time to add a crazy amount of Thixo to every piece that's going to make contact with that outer skin. Lube it up really good. A little slish, a little slosh, a little slip. That's not a thing. I'm not going to say that again. And it was time to clamp our plywood in place. Now, this is a little trickier than it looks because that plywood actually has to twist quite a bit from that upper line to that lower line. So I clamped it on the top first and added some screws up there so it really couldn't move at all. After I got a few screws in on the top, then I clamped it really tight on the bottom and added some screws down there. And then after I added some screws on the top and bottom, I went back and added even more screws in between the screws that I added previously on the top and the bottom, until it was, well, really, really screwed. If this isn't fine woodworking at its best, I don't know what is. Then I grabbed another piece of 1/4-inch plywood, held it up the other side, traced that out so it was the right shape, and gooped that side up with a ton more Thixo. Then I used the same method that I used on the other side on this side because it worked so well the first time. The only difference was I started at the bow this time to make sure that it wouldn't slip off of that line on the front. Added screws on the top, added screws on the bottom, removed all my clamps, and we were on to skinning the back portion. Now we come to that seam, where I was saying we probably should have figured out a better way to do this. In hindsight, a little fiberglass probably would have been our best bet. But I was in a hurry, so I added a little backer piece, a crazy amount of Thixo, and a staple gun to just hold it in place. Then I added a ton of screws on that seam and a bunch more Thixo Flex, which is a Thixo that actually flexes. So if that seam wants to move, hopefully it'll still stay glued together and watertight. Then I just slowly started working my way around the outside of the stock tank, bending that 1/4-inch plywood and using rivets on the top and bottom to hold it in place. When I got to my seam, I did the same thing with that backer board, a bunch of screws, and a bunch more Thixo Flex. And just like that, the entire outside of the boat was skinned in 1/4-inch plywood. Next, we needed to flip the entire thing upside down so I could work on adding the bottom. This is easier said than done, because now we're dealing with this giant teardrop. It's round on one side and wants to roll, it's pointed on the other side, and I'm not really confident in the strength of it yet, so I didn't want to put too much weight on that bow. But with Craig's help, we were able to very carefully flip it upside down. Now my initial thought was just to set it back up on the sawhorses. So we started to do that, and I quickly realized that the stock tank is hollow on the underside, so there's not a lot of places to rest the sawhorses on. So we abandoned that idea, and I decided it would probably be safer if I just set it directly on the floor. It was at this point that I stood back and really started to admire the beauty of this thing. I mean, it's got some nice curves to it. It was looking sexy and very boat-like. I trimmed down the bow on the underside, sanded everything flat, and now it was time to sand the bottom with that 1/2-inch plywood. The only problem is, a 4x8 sheet of plywood was not long enough or wide enough to cover the entire bottom with one piece. So I was gonna have to use 2 pieces. I set a full piece over the stock tank and the bottom of the boat. I traced out that round shape on the bottom, and then I had to trace out a round shape to match the curve of the stock tank. This was a little tricky, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it and get it to fit exactly perfect. And then I realized if I used some double-sided tape and stuck a piece in the dead center of the stock tank with a 1/4-inch hole drilled in it, then I could take a 1/4-inch dowel, insert it into that hole, insert a little piece of scrap 1/4-inch plywood into that dowel, mark the edge of my stock tank like so, make sure that it's going to match all the way around, which it does, and then all I have to do is use a marker against that mark, and I can trace the shape of the stock tank onto my piece of plywood all the way around. I'm not sure this was the correct way of doing things, but I like to think it's the way that the professional stock tank boat builders would have done it. Next, I use a jigsaw to cut that outer shape of the boat, leaving it a little bit long so I had some wiggle room. And then using the jigsaw, I cut right on my traced line because I want that to be perfect. Now the moment of truth. I carried the entire piece over to my boat and slid it into place. And dang, it actually fit pretty darn good. Nailed it. Actually, I'm gonna glue and screw it. There's no nails in the building of this boat. Then I had that one little piece I had to add towards the front. Now you might be saying, now you're gonna have a seam on the bottom of your boat? Isn't that gonna cause problems? Well, don't worry. I actually have a very good solution for that seam, but I'm not going to get to that for a little while, so just stay tuned. We'll deal with that later. So with all my bottom pieces cut, I removed them, squirted a bunch more Thixo on every single rib and edge and area and void and crack and crevice, just pretty much Thixo all over the place. And I set my bottom back in place. The boat's bottom back in place. I added my little front piece using the Thixo Flex on that seam, just, in case. But don't worry, I got another fail-safe that'll cover up that seam also. So, just wait. Now, if there's one thing I've learned in boat building, it's that the best way to attach the bottom to your boat is by drilling a bunch of holes in it. This is key, because every good boat bottom has a bunch of holes in it. But don't worry, I went back and I covered up each screw hole with some Thixo. I also used Thixo, again like caulking, around the seam transition from my plywood to my stock tank. Now when I built this, I made sure that my plywood is exactly level with the metal of my stock tank, so it's a nice even transition. There was, however, this drop-down transition from the plywood on the sides around the outside of the stock tank. So I sealed that entire section up with some more Thixo, and I have a plan to make it disappear later. But again, you'll just have to wait. After my Thixo was nice and dry, I came in with the multi-tool and I trimmed the bottom down so it was perfectly flush with my sides. This part was really satisfying because it's starting to lose that rough stock tank look and starting to gain that nice, sexy boat look. After trimming my bottom down, that sounds like something you do after Thanksgiving. Anyways, I pulled out my sander and I sanded all my transitions smooth. Now I'm going to paint this thing eventually, so I wasn't too concerned about my plywood and burning through my veneer. All I was concerned with was making sure everything was nice and smooth. Once that was done, Craig helped me flip the entire thing back over, and now we had to do something about this giant void towards the front. Now, to be completely honest, I could probably put a skin on the top of this and it would be watertight and be totally fine. But that seemed a little bit boring, and if I'm not going to overbuild this, what's the point? I did stop and wonder if I should add some ballast in the front of the boat. Because if you remember the boat I built with Michael Alm, one of our major problems with that boat was it wasn't heavy enough in the front, so we could never get it on plane. But after putting some weight in the front of the boat, I freaked myself out thinking it's going to be way too heavy and do a nosedive. This really stumped me. To add weight or not to add weight? That was until I put a tape measure on the boat and I realized something. If you measure from the bow of the boat to the edge of the stock tank and the edge of the stock tank to the back of the stock tank, you realize that the stock tank passes the middle of the boat. And the front bench seat is actually going to be past the middle line of the boat. So if I need to add weight to help with the distribution in the future, I think I can just do it under the bench seat inside the stock tank, and I don't have to permanently add weight towards the front of the boat. Because if I put weight in the front of the boat, it's not coming out, because I'm just about to fill that entire front up with some total boat flotation foam. Now, as I mentioned, this is probably unnecessary, but I've seen this stuff online before and I really wanted an excuse to use it. It's basically a 2-part mixture. I poured the 2 parts into a 5-gallon bucket while Craig mixed it up. Now you have to work fast because you only have a few seconds to pour this where it needs to go before crazy things start to happen. And if you're wondering what crazy things are going to happen, well, just wait. This stuff is magical. It's going to expand and fill the front of this boat. At least, that's what it says it does on the label. At first, I thought it was broken because nothing was happening, and then all of a sudden... Now, we didn't actually read the labels, so we poured that first section wrong, and it didn't expand like it should. I guess technically you're supposed to pour in thin layers, let it expand and then pour some more. Where with that first pour, we just poured it like 4 inches thick, so it didn't expand as much as it could. We changed this on our second pour, and as you can see, it almost filled the thing up completely. And our third pour, well, it filled it up way more than it should have. But then I had this idea to hook 2 pieces of wood on the end of a piece of cable and use it like a giant pole saw and just trim that foam flush on the top. I wasn't sure if this was going to work because sometimes I have really stupid ideas, but this is one of those rare times that my stupid idea was actually a brilliant idea. And we just carved that flotation foam like a big block of cheese, and pretty soon we had it nice and level with the top of our boat frame. Doesn't this kind of make you want vanilla ice cream? I had a little cleanup to do on the outside of the boat, but luckily a putty knife scraped this off fairly easily. And with that, we were ready to skin the top. Now, the flotation foam might not do anything to add to the buoyancy of the boat because it was already going to be a big pocket of air that would keep the boat afloat. But what it will do is help with the rigidity of the front, especially when I put this 1/4 inch ply on the top. Without the flotation foam, if you walked on the bow of the boat, you might fall through. But with the flotation foam, you'll be able to walk across this 1/4 inch ply and it'll be plenty strong. So after laying a sheet of the plywood over the bow of my boat and tracing out the general shape, I cut it out with a jigsaw and then I set it back on the boat. The problem was I couldn't really get the inside perimeter of the stock tank, which is what I really needed to fit this piece of plywood to. So I made this little jig from a broken piece of pencil and a scrap piece of plywood that allowed me to trace the shape underneath the lip of the stock tank onto my plywood. This would give me an exact fit on the front of that lip. Once I had that shape traced out, I used my jigsaw upside down so I could get a nice clean cut on the top of my plywood, and what do you know? It fit perfectly. Now, as you can tell, I'm going to have to use 2 separate pieces of plywood with a seam down the middle because one sheet isn't going to be big enough for the entire top. I tested to see if I could just flip my piece from one side to the other, and I was very surprised to see that I could, because when I tried to do that in the Airstream, it never worked. So apparently stock tanks are a lot more uniform than Airstreams. Now you know. Once again, I added a bunch of Thixo on top of all of my rib pieces. I set my top in place, and then I just used a staple gun to hook it down to all the ribs. This might seem crazy because staples probably aren't that strong, but it's really not the staples that's giving it strength. It's the Thixo. Pretty much this entire boat is held together with Thixo. In no time, I managed to get the other half of my top glued in place and stapled down. And then I started to realize something. This boat is taking a lot longer than I expected. And I'm not sure we're going to have enough time to finish. Bear attack.